Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics such as investing, cash flow, budgeting, saving, passive income, debt management, and much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the 360 Money Matters podcast. I'm Billy and I'm joined by my co-host,
Andrew. Bills, here we are back again, another episode of 360 Money Matters.
Andrew, another episode, and I'm excited with this one because this is a little bit more technical in terms of, the thinking around it and what we're going to talk about. But like always, the 360 Money Matters podcast is going to deliver a whole heap of value, I'm sure.
Absolutely. So tell us, Bills, you've teed it up nicely. What are we talking about today?
So basically, we're just going to compare and contrast on a fairly high level, I guess, in terms of from an investment perspective, should you invest in your own name versus a trust?
Yeah.
Looking at the pros, the cons, the costs, all of the things that we consider and think about when we're making recommendations to people, and basically how you should go about thinking about it, because there's, like I said, there's pros and cons with each of those, and trying to give everybody a little bit more clarity around what this looks like, what's available, and maybe it helps shape your thinking in terms of, should I go one way or another?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess first place to maybe start is to probably talk about maybe two of the most commonly utilized types of trusts.
Yeah.
So there are more, but most people, when you're talking about trust from an investment perspective, you're usually either talking about a unit trust or a discretionary or family trust. And in essence, there's there's one main distinction between them. And a unit trust is in that there are particular units that are associated with that trust, and all of the income gets divided amongst the ownership of units. So let's say me and Billy, have a unit trust, then all of a sudden there's, maybe 70% ownership in Billy's, or Billy's got 70% of the units and I've got 30% of the units. Well, 70% of the profits will go to Billy and 30% will go to me. So it's dictating the profit that will ultimately come out of it or how the profit is distributed. And then there's a discretionary trust or a family trust. And in that, you get to choose who receives the profits in a particular year. So even though one person may have done, more of the work, or one person may have generated more of the income, or may have, theoretically more of an ownership in that trust, it doesn't need to be distributed as per the units. You actually choose how that's divided in a particular year.
So as the name suggests, in that particular instance, and I think that's a real key one to draw down on, but it is discretionary. So you can you've then got the flexibility, depending on what's happened in that taxable year, to be able to determine sort of what you do with the income from that perspective. And if there's, members of that discretionary trust that are earning less income, then maybe you direct more of the income into their name to pay less tax along the way. So from that perspective, probably a couple of key call-outs in my mind. Firstly, from a trust perspective, it's a separate legal entity than the individual. And then if it's something like a discretionary trust, you have the discretion to be able to then point the income into a particular area that you may not necessarily get with a fixed unit trust.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, we'll dwell down on that further, but I think the important thing to note here is just there are a couple of different types of trusts, and generally when we're speaking about this, we're usually talking about a discretionary trust because from an investment perspective, it's usually what most people are considering when you're looking to do, something or when you're establishing a trust for an investment purpose, particularly within a family unit.
Yeah, and I guess the other wording that we see is family trust.
Yeah.
But if you dig a little bit deeper, it's a discretionary trust, which gives it the discretion to be able to do that, right?
Correct.
Yep.
Correct.
Used case, the main one that comes off the top of my head, just thinking about the separate legal entity part, automatically my mind goes to asset protection.
Yeah.
So being able to hold assets in something other than, I guess, the most common things that we talk about, owning them, say, individually, owning it within, a superannuation fund. This is another option to be able to house assets that is outside of, I guess, those two main ones that we talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. So you talk about asset protection in this instance. I mean, and this isn't to say that, all assets cannot be accessed from a trust if something were to happen and someone were to come after you, but it adds a layer of protection, and bundled in with a number of other things that you can do, it means that you can protect your assets in the event that creditors or someone pursuing you was to come after your assets. So there is a layer of added asset protection that forms as a part of owning your assets through a trust and in a separate legal entity.
Yeah, and without getting sort of too complicated in our thinking with this, at the crux of it in my mind, there's really two main reasons why you'd pursue owning any type of asset, or even considering opening up a trust. Yep. And there's really two things from my perspective. And unfortunately, sometimes they work in conflict with one another, but you're talking a tax minimization strategy, like what we were referring to before with the discretionary trust, or an asset protection strategy. Yep. So if you go down one path, it's almost at the compromise of the other, and vice versa. It is difficult to try and get both asset protection and tax minimization. But in my mind, it's usually one or the other that leads the conversation, that then leads into that being a potential solution in terms of what people are looking for.
Yeah. So look, we've touched on some of the tax benefits. Let's delve into the weeds a little bit. How does it work? How does it provide opportunities for tax minimization? I mean, how does a discretionary trust work in this instance, Bill?
Yeah, so we might use a really simplistic example like the business that we've got here. Yep. Let's just say, one person owned the business, and the business makes $100,000 in profit. And let's just assume that you're the business owner in this instance. Yep. Assuming that 100,000 all gets added. If it's owned in your name, it all gets added to Andrew's assessable income. Yep. So whatever your tax rate will be.
So this is if you don't have a trust.
This is if you own it individually. Yep. And this could be a business, this could be shares, whatever it may be. But the income basically gets from the business or from the investment and gets added directly on top of your assessable income. So whatever your tax rate is, or whatever your assessable income is, just add that hypothetical 100 grand on top.
Yep.
So if you're at a particular tax rate, you'll be paying that tax rate, and it might even push you up the tax brackets as well. Now, take that same example and say that the profit is 100,000 and you now own that asset, being the business, in your family trust. Maybe you then say, okay, rather than me taking all of the income in my name and lumping $100,000 onto my assessable income, I'm actually going to split it with my wife. Yeah. So you give Stacey $50,000 to tax or to add on to her assessable income, and you take the other 50 and add it to yours. Or let's just say in a year that her income is lower because, I don't know, maybe there's another child or maternity leave or whatever. You might turn around and say, hey, let's take that 100,000, bypass me altogether, and put it into her name.
Yep.
And that way, you're basically working through the tax brackets to try and the income still comes to the family unit.
But it's not all been directed to one person that's been kicked up to top marginal tax rate.
That's exactly right. So that's the really simplistic example of how you'd use that in order to minimize your tax using discretionary trust.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think the other thing that's important with it is you can choose each and every single year.
Yep.
How you distribute it. It doesn't need to be the same every year. You don't need to, set a rate at the start or anything like that. And so in one particular year, you might decide to put it towards one person's assessable income. In another year, you might decide to put it towards another person's assessable income, depending on what their income is for that financial year. And you don't need to make that decision until you're doing your tax return. So the beauty of it is, okay, let's say, there's two people in a household and two people are earning commission or getting bonuses. And so you're not 100% sure where their income is going to end up in the financial year. It allows you the flexibility to say, okay, well, after all is said and done, after I know what is certain, I can then direct income to a particular person and help keep yourself underneath the top marginal tax rate.
Yeah. No, perfect example. Set it up with that flexibility in mind, but not having to make that decision until kind of after the fact and what's happened. So it could be, for a particular income earner that earns bonuses, maybe your bonuses are higher than expected that year, then, you'd potentially move some of the income to, say, a spouse.
Yep.
Or if it was the other way, then maybe you'd take it because, you've got less income flowing through your name. So
the other thing that I've seen this work very, very well with is between partners where there's a significant age difference between them. And so one of the partners may be retired, not drawing an income while the other person is still working, or all of their investments and all of their assets are providing an income to that person that isn't taking a regular wage and a salary. Same story when you're talking about capital gains as well. So you talk about you've sold an asset, have a massive capital gains implication, being able to choose who you can split that to, and then potentially talk about, adult children that you can also potentially distribute income to and all of that stuff. It means that it can be a very powerful mechanism of tax minimization, which is absolutely beneficial 99.9% of the time. But that 0.1% of the time, I do want to highlight is minimizing your tax means that you're minimizing your income, which can impact your ability to borrow. So if you do have lending requirements, if you do have, upcoming mortgage that you're wanting to work towards, or you're knowing that you're going to make a purchase at a future point in time, make sure that you're also tying in your broker in that scenario, because you don't want to minimize the tax at the expense of minimizing your ability to borrow as well.
That is a common, occurrence and problem that we see all of the time, especially with self-employed people. Because on one hand, you want to pay less tax. So think about it. You're approaching the end of the financial year. So maybe you go and buy a whole heap of plant and equipment and whatever it may be, and run up your expenses to pay less tax. But then it means if you need borrowing capacity, and this is exactly the same as what we're talking about here. If you need borrowing capacity in order to satisfy lending requirements, then so it's kind of going back to what I said before. You can kind of have almost one or the other.
Well, that's why you need a plan, right? I mean, it's important to, as much as you can, because life is not always that certain, but you want to be able to plan ahead for all of the events that you're likely to have at a future point in time, and adjust your strategy to find that balance within that as well.
And look, another thing to add a little bit of complexity to this is you think about all of the advantages that we've been discussing and talking about. The cost associated with establishing and running these things also needs to be taken into account. So although the benefits sound great, you probably need to weigh that up. You definitely need to weigh that up with the complexity and the cost of setting it up and running it, and the benefit that you're going to get. So in the example where, you're getting income coming in from a particular investment, whether it's an investment portfolio, properties, whether it's a business, if you're taking larger amounts of income, for me, it makes sense. But if it's not, and it's only a small amount of money, then the cost and the complexity associated with it is probably not justified in that instance as well too. So some planning needs to go into it, and this is also the conundrum that you've got to deal with when you set up an investment. You've not only got to think about that point in time, you've got to think about it down the track. So it may not necessarily pay to put, say, a business that you've started in a trust at that point in time, because the business is not really doing much. But if the business goes really well,
then all of a sudden completely different story, right?
You don't want to have to do that later down the track. So there's a bit of complexity with it, and sort of throwing back to your point, Andrew, getting advice on it from financial advisor and accountant is absolutely imperative.
Yeah, and look, when you talk about costs, I think it's also an important thing to note of what type of assets that you do hold in a trust. So particular assets, like when you're looking at potentially property and holding that through a trust, the cost of stamp duty can be a little bit higher. Same story when you're talking about land tax. There are some implications with the costs that are associated with it. So doing that cost benefit analysis is ultimately very important. And understanding what assets you hold in the trust and what assets you don't hold in the trust. So for instance, when we talk about the income that's associated with a trust, all of it must get distributed. So let's say the trust, well, a property that's held within a trust generates more rental income than expense.
Yep.
And that is, works out to be $10,000 a year. That $10,000 a year must be distributed every year. You can't hold it in a trust. If it makes a loss, so negatively gearing a property, your expenses are higher than what your income is associated with that property, a trust cannot distribute a loss. It can only offset the gains made in that same year. And so, in essence, you're losing the tax benefits associated with negative gearing when you're holding a property within a trust.
Yeah. So that throws to some of the complexity that we were talking about before, that when you're thinking about this at the start, you really need to think down the track about what this is, because it sounds great. You may turn around and say in that instance, for whatever reason, I want to put that property in a trust from an asset protection perspective, then obviously you're hampering your tax effectiveness strategy through being able to negative gear if you owned it in your own name.
Yeah, absolutely. Another important thing, so trusts do still get, or ownership in trusts still get the 50% discount on holding an asset for longer than 12 months.
You're talking the CGT discount, capital gains tax discount.
So if you've held an asset for longer than 12 months, you get a 50% reduction in capital gains tax, other than superannuation, because that's at a different rate.
Yep.
But you get a 50% reduction in capital gains tax when you're holding the asset for longer than 12 months. Whether you're holding that personally or whether you're holding that within a trust, you still get that benefit. Mm-hmm. The only structure where you don't get that benefit is through a company. So in a company structure, you don't get any of the 50% capital gains tax discount.
Yep. Andrew, I don't know. I think we've covered off on a range of different things to sort of think about. It was just a bit of a quick summary around owning assets in your own name versus a trust. But I think we've ticked everything off that we wanted to talk about. I don't think we've missed anything.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the important thing to note within all of this is whether it's appropriate, not appropriate, there's probably a few conversations that need to be had, you with your financial advisor, as well as your accountant as well, and then potentially even legal professionals. Mm-hmm. But making sure that you're getting this right from the very beginning is really important, because when you are transferring ownership and when you are trying to move money between personal and individual and a trust, it can incur stamp duty and buy-sell costs and all of that stuff. So getting it right in the beginning and thinking about what you're going to be doing in the future is ultimately what you need to do when you're looking at and investing it throughout this means.
So all I heard there was get advice.
Yeah.
Actually, exactly. You know what?
That should just be the ending of all of our podcast episodes is get advice.
Well, that's right. But I think we rename it, rather than the 360 Money Matters podcast. We should change it to the 360 Get Advice podcast. Because essentially, there's different things that need to be taken into consideration. And it's really difficult if you're not in the game and that's not your profession. How do you then, you may think that this is doing the right thing and the unintended consequences of it. So getting advice is something that we always advocate for. But look, Andrew, thank you for another episode today. It was a quick one, but a good one. Lot of information packed in there, and hopefully we gave our listeners and our viewers a whole heap of info that they can go away and consider for their own circumstances.
Thanks, Bills. Appreciate it. And thanks again to all of our listeners and our viewers. And if you like this episode, subscribe, and we look forward to catching you on the next one.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we talked about or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
Just a reminder to our listeners that the information contained in this podcast is general in nature and is not intended as personal recommendations for the audience. Please consider whether the information suits your circumstances before acting on it. This information is provided by Billy Amaritis and Andrew Nicolou of 360 Financial Strategists Proprietary Limited, authorised representatives and credit representatives of AMP Financial Planning.